that would be so fabulous. Totally.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today on the occasion of Exiles from the Future Volume 2. Woo! This exhibition is a fundraiser in support of the People's Voice newspaper. It was organized by myself as well as Mandan Murphy, who couldn't be here today because he has a 1-week-old baby. But all his hard work is felt in not only the curation of the artists, but the organization of the online store, which is online now, so feel free to peruse if any of the objects look tantalizing to you. They're all for sale, although some of them are already sold, so you may be too late. But we're sitting, if you haven't been here before, we're in Pumice Raft, which is a space that I run. It's a nonprofit art space. It's been here since 2019. And we show all sorts of different artworks, emerging artists, Canadian, international. And I'm really excited to host the panel today. Sorry, I'm standing in front of you guys, but yeah, it's a personal. I have a personal connection to this panel as well. I worked as an installer. That's how Vanessa and I originally met. We worked on staff at the power plant, and it's simultaneously one of the best jobs I've ever had, but also most fraught with kind of lack of sustainability and quality of life. So I'm not sure that we will solve all these issues today, but I'm excited to kind of get into them and unpack them. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to pass it over to Jack Copple, our moderator for today.
Thanks, Parker. Yeah, so just before we get started, there is a few things I wanted to do before I introduce and get started on beautiful panelists. First, I'd just like to say, if anyone needs it, there is a washroom upstairs, just an item of housekeeping. And as Parker mentioned, all the pieces on the wall today are available for purchase. They're available online, but we're also accepting, if you want to ensure that People's Voice and Pumice Raft can continue to do really fantastic exhibitions like this, we're also accepting donations, and subscriptions and free papers are available just over there. Second, I'd just like to quickly do a land acknowledgement. So People's Voice recognizes that its work and the work of its community partners takes place on the traditional Indigenous territories in Toronto. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and it is now the home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We are thankful to be able to work and live in these territories, and we are thankful to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have cared for these territories for centuries. We also need to recognize with this land acknowledgement and use it as a reminder of our important work that we must commit to and expand upon in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. We stand in solidarity with the 1492 Land Back Lane defenders, with the Wet'suwet'en and land defenders and their allies across the province. We stand in solidarity with the families of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and with the families of children who never returned. We must organize with these and all other Indigenous people against the ongoing genocide perpetuated by the Canadian state and big business, with the end goal of winning Indigenous nations' right to self-determination and sovereignty up to and including secession. All right. So as I said, my name's Jack Copple, and I'll be moderating the panel today. For those of you who were at our opening last night and spoke to me at the reception or just before we got started earlier today, are pretty likely going to place that I'm a little out of place compared to our panelists. I'm a bit of the odd man out here. I don't have any personal background in the arts. The closest I ever came to doing art labor was cutting some diagrams out of a book entitled Rare Fish of the Atlantic and hanging them, kind of like mostly level around my first apartment. So my background is in the trade union movement. During my time working for over 10 years as a server and bartender, I was able to participate in a successful worker-led organizing drive at the Gladstone Hotel. After getting our union certified at the Gladstone, I then sat on the bargaining committee and then as the property's first shop steward. While I'm no longer on the shop floor, I now work as a staffer for the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, where we represent over 225,000 unionized workers across the city. So thank you very much for having me here today. Our panelists include Vanessa Rieger, an artist, senior technician, and shop steward at the Power Plant Union, who participated in the recent successful power plant organizing drive and contract negotiations. Megan Christou, an artist, installer at the AGO, young worker representative for OPSU 535, and a member of the bargaining committee and picket captain for the ongoing 535 strike at the AGO. And Louis Jacob, an artist, assistant professor at the University of Toronto, and member for Artists for Palestine. So to our panelists, welcome. So I want to give just a few opening remarks before we get in on the questions about art and labor, particularly their history in Toronto, what brings us here today, what we're going to be talking about. So the first strike in Toronto history, and one of the first in Canada, was led by workers in the Toronto printing trade. They walked off the job in protest of wages and working conditions, and in support of a nascent 9-hour movement, which had been being organized in Canada to shorten the standard working day. Their action inspired a movement across the country, which contributed directly to the development of trade unions across English-speaking Canada and in Quebec, and was a milestone in what would be a long and important relationship between workers in the creative industries and the labor movement. Whereas before, feudal relations had left creative industries and the arts to the small workshops of the artisans and the patrician whims of noblemen and aristocrats, the Industrial Revolution had brought it directly into the factories and into the hand of skilled laborers. Illustration, lithography, typography, printing, painting, design, typesetting, drafting, and other industry had become, for the first time, socially organized under the stewardship of an increasingly industrialized working class. The impact this had on workers in the creative industries is really difficult to overstate. Through organized struggle in these and other industries, working people were able to wrench back power and wealth from the capitalist class and attempt to use it to build a life for themselves. Even though they were only able to win back a small portion of what they created for wealthy industrialists, through struggle, they won an 8-hour workday, weekends, statutory holidays, a national healthcare system, wages enough to support them and their families, and more. Just as a brief anecdote, I was recently reading about a cartoonist for the Guelph Mercury Tribune who, after a strike there, was able to buy a house, a car, and send his kids to school on the single income he was provided for by the small regional paper. And this was contrasted by his granddaughter, who was telling the story, also a cartoonist, who had to work a second full-time job and a part-time job just to scrape by an apartment in the same neighborhood today. So in addition, the newly afforded leisure time, won through organized struggle, had left more working people with a greater opportunity for self-expression. Public works led to the widespread proliferation of public galleries, and the explosion of communications, media, and technology allowed a variety of artistic works to spread at a speed previously unheard of. Art itself also played an important role in the communication of theory and the tactics of struggle, and artists form an integral part of the fight back during the history of the labor movement in Canada. From the early newspapers and pamphlets developed in labor's nascent days, to the cultural movement surrounding the New Left in the 60s and 70s, and the role the artists played in the Metro Days of Action in the 90s, which saw a massive one-day general strike in Toronto, supported by hundreds of thousands of working people in the city and even more across the province. To the current struggle for Palestinian liberation, which has seen working people show solidarity both in the streets and through creative expression. The important relationship between art, labor, and working people struggles continues to this day, and it's what we're going to be talking about in just a moment. And while the capitalist class has slowly been clawing back the gains made by working people over the 20th century, the ongoing struggle we see today reflects that working people are not ready to give up. 2023 saw the highest level of strike activity in Canada since 1986, and that trend shows no sign of slowing down, with militant strike activity sweeping the city and the country as working people fight for what is rightfully theirs. So with that, I'll go to the questions for the panel. So to our panelists, lots of people come into the arts industry kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, but soon learn that it can be just as exploitative as any other industry. Looking at your own journey as artists and art workers, both installers and educators. Was there a moment which opened your eyes to how the industry uses and abuses both artists and workers to increase its profits? And Louis, maybe we'll start with you and work our way down.
Okay, sure. Is the microphone working all right? Just wanted to double check. Great. I mean, it's interesting, like, speaking as an artist, our society really trains us to see ourselves as like self-exploitable. That the work of being an artist is so-called a labor of love. Such things do exist, but they do seem to kind of like overlap quite nicely with a broader political context in which exploitation is the dominant form. So I do think a lot about this idea of the artist as kind of the perfect self-exploitable subject. And as an artist, how can we develop other forms of self-identification and relationship with other people? You know, the promise is always the carrot, so to speak. It's always the idea that you suffer now, you work really hard for nothing. Other people can benefit from your work, but eventually you'll be discovered, and then you'll land in the promised land, and you'll have enough income, and you're all good. I called it a carrot because that's always kind of like a deferred promise, right? That is used to kind of justify one's own condition. So maybe I'll just kind of start it with that, just like as an idea to think about, and I'm sure we can kind of come back to that. I'm curious to see.
Thanks,
how other
Louis. Yeah,
folks think
Vanessa.
about it.
Hi, thanks for having me. I guess for me in my own personal journey, coming into the arts industry, I started originally in the trades, working when I was quite young, up until I started going to OCAD as a carpenter. So when I came into the art world, I had more of a trades understanding of, you know, labor and worth of labor. And I was kind of surprised to see how in the art world there was this kind of like okayed behavior of getting a lot of free labor from people, call them unpaid internships. And just from within my own kind of journey in art handling and working as a gallery technician, I started seeing some of my coworkers' skills being exploited or being told, do it for the exposure, do it for the notch on your CV, and then kind of like proceed elsewhere. So there's kind of like in this culture of like permanent rotating doors of people not expected to stay at their jobs, but rather to gain this experience and get exploited essentially, and then move on. And therefore there's always this like flow of, let's say, like newly graduated OCAD students who are looking for a foot in the door and accepting pay wages that aren't livable. And they do so because, first of all, they see everyone else kind of doing it because it's like this condoned culture, and then get exploited. And then as they move on, they realize, I have more rights. I am worth more. My skills are actually worth more as they start to gain more like real life experience. So how it started for me was starting by advocating for some of my coworkers, knowing what I know in terms of what certain skills are worth, and letting people know, just so you know, what you just did right there, you could actually get twice as much money for. And maybe you should negotiate a different pay with your employer. So that's kind of how it started for me.
Thanks, Vanessa. Yeah, Megan.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. It's been hard to be retrospective because of being on strike right now. I'm thinking like future, but it did remind me of starting as an art installer. Often you try to take like as many gigs as you possibly can. So I was freelancing for a private gallerist in the city, and I remember installing a show for him, and it was a show that had like hundreds of artworks, but it was just me installing. So it took me until like, I think it started at 8 a.m. and it took me until like 9:30 to finish. And he had a satellite location, and it was a snowstorm that day. So I said, it's a bit unsafe for me to drive. My excuse, I was trying to get out of going to the satellite location and installing actually Rajni Pereira's show there. And Rajani was really good. Rajani was like, just say it's snowing and you can't go. Like, just, it's okay. Someone else will do it the next day. But he said, oh, I've already called you a cab. It's taking you to the second location. So then I ended up installing till 1 a.m. But I'd never negotiated in the private sector, like what overtime pay looks like what a break schedule looks like, what premiums look like. And after that, I just was like, I'm done working in the private sector. Like, I'm obviously not very good at advocating for myself. So I'm going to go into the museum world. And then you just see similar things happening, but with salaried employers or salaried employees. So you see people who have so many skills, use those skills, even though they're being paid to do actually something different. Like, so yeah, basically exploiting the special niche things that people have. And they're not making as much as, someone who is paid double what they're paid as a designer. They're my carpenter in the wood shop who have to fix the designer's plans and redo them and make it palatable and perfect for the curators and perfect for the show. And it has to be on time for the media opening and And it's just like this never ending cycle of us as creative people constantly kind of exploiting ourselves because of the lack of transparency and the lack of advocating for each other.
Thanks, Megan. One thing that I think you all kind of touched on a little bit is this, we do it for our passion, which kind of this like individualized hustle culture that permeates a lot of different facets of our society. Maybe let's talk about that a little bit more. What kind of role does eagerness and naivete play into making people more exploitable because they are so passionate about the industry, right? It's an industry you go into because you love it. As a kind of follow-up question onto that, in your experience, can that same eagerness be used to organize around, right? Can we get people excited to step up for work that they're passionate about? When we were organizing at the Gladstone, I would tell people, we're not organizing a unit because we hate being bartenders. It's because we love it. We want to create the working conditions that'll allow us to continue to do it for a really long time. So I'd be curious to know what you think about that. Maybe Megan, we'll start with you this time and work our way back.
So when basically what you said was the same line that I used to motivate workers at the AGO for the last 2 years to get them to do more work within the union to actually file grievances. So if you're not sure what a grievance means, it means that you have a collective agreement, or we call it the CBA. There are clauses in that agreement, and if you feel those clauses have been violated, you go to your steward and you talk about it, and then inevitably you can file a grievance against your employer, depending if you can resolve that with your employer. Sometimes you can resolve it in-house. Often, more than not, at the AGO, we've been sending grievances to arbitration, so to the higher body within the Ministry of Labour, which would be the Ontario Labour Relations Board. And so, like, for instance, I'm still waiting for a grievance. I'm a year over, so I'm still waiting for my arbitration date against the gallery. But that was how I knew that I could get us to go on strike. I knew it would take 2 years to basically build those relationships because it's a lot of trust. People have to trust that you have the interests of the collective in mind. But it was because I told people, like, I'm tired of being told, go find another job. Like, this is it for me. This is the highest level of work that I can get in this city. And I want my career for the next 30, 40 years to be here. So instead of finding a new job, I'm going to make this place better. And I think we're doing that. I think we've proven that. And that has a domino effect. So the Royal Ontario Museum just took a strike vote, and their strike vote is 98.7%. So they're looking at possibly, depending on how their negotiations go, if they fail, they'll also be able to go on strike because they know it's possible, because they see that we can do it and that you'll get support from artists and you'll get support from the labor movement as well. We're lucky to be in an industry to be able to leverage those two communities to come out and help us. But yeah, that was the line that I took. Like, let's make this better. Let's not keep looking for other places that are just going to also exploit us.
Thanks, Megan. Vanessa?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question because it's like, is the problem eagerness and naivete? I think those are good things to have if you're passionate. It shouldn't be a detriment to you that you're passionate about something, but why is that eagerness being exploited? talking and working with other artists and installers, when you take a job for a pay cut, you're not just taking that cut for yourself, you're taking it for all your coworkers. You're essentially saying, this is okay. I'm enabling this incredible pay cut and undercutting everyone around me by doing that, because we are collectively part of a trade, part of a profession. And there is kind of this treatment of like, we'll find another you if you don't do this. Oh, you don't want to do that for that amount of money? Well, we'll find someone who will. And I think that's kind of like the catching point. If we all refused that low wage and they had no one to fill in for you, then we would all benefit. We would all get that increase. So I think it's about perspective instead of kind of blaming the new people who don't know any better. Well, why are they being exploited? Because they don't know any better. The employers, it's not in their incentive to let you know what your rights are, because then they could keep exploiting you. So part of what I ended up falling into this role of educating my coworkers, educating newer technicians who didn't know certain things about their rights in employment or their health and safety rights, which for me was a huge thing on the job. You get a lot of new technicians coming in who don't have a background in the trades and are fresh out of art school. They don't know what it is to be on a job site. And if your job isn't giving you that training because they see you as replaceable, then it kind of does the snowball effect. Yeah.
It's a great answer. Yeah. Thank you. Louis.
So your question was about this eagerness, but also tied into it was this idea of individualism. And as I'm hearing you both speak, I'm like seeing Liam's the coffee cups piece that each have a different person with a letter on their shirt, and if they're arranged in a particular order, it says organized. But of course, they can be arranged in different orders in which the text becomes illegible or invisible. And so making me think about kind of how if we think of our existence as being beyond individual, all these other horizons become possible. So I was thinking about kind of like there's almost like social roots of this individualistic eagerness. I tie it to like a kind of romantic idea of the artist that if you suffer, you're more authentic or you have more to express or something like that, and those are deeply held in the society and like taught to people from very young to kind of assume that that's what being an artist is or being creative is. And those don't help people. I think it's just important to recognize, is this fantasy useful to me or is it acting against, what we're trying to do? But there's also systemic things, like I was just thinking, like, I was born in 1971, which is kind of the marker around when neoliberalism is usually kind of said to be starting, which is a kind of ongoing dismantling of a kind of social safety net, labor protections, labor rights. So I was born into that world in which the dismantling was the norm or the way of things. So it's really encouraging to hear that actually now there's so much more strike action than there's been in decades. It seems like there's a kind of other forms of association and knowledge kind of resurging. So I'm very interested in that, but definitely these kind of like romantic ideas of individualism as being somehow more true or more inspired or something like that, it doesn't help. It doesn't serve us well.
Well, yeah, and it's used to kind of take advantage of that excitement, really, which you're absolutely right, Vanessa, is a good quality. And it turns suffering almost into a virtue, right? And it takes that phrase, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life, but it underlines it, right? It really says, actually, if you love what you do, you will work every single day of your life for minimum wage, right? So on that same topic, I want to move on now to talk about some of the cultural spaces in the city. They like to put forward this very progressive face. They do it both to allude to the progressive and often countercultural role that art has played in the past. And I think they also like to try to stake out their claim on what they see as the future and their role in the future. while that presentation certainly helps improve their profits and cultural cachet, we certainly see that it isn't the case that they actually are practicing what they preach. So, I want to drill into a few instances for our panelists. So, Vanessa, you were part of an organizing drive at the power plant union, which saw the entire board resign in response to the union coming in.
Well, they say officially it had nothing to do with the union.
I'm sure, yeah. Did you feel like they were living their progressive politics when creating the working conditions there or during the organizing and bargaining?
Obviously, no. And also, just as a reminder, I am only but one person on a major organization, the union. I am a representative of the tech department, but there's also the gallery attendants and the office staff and admin. So all of us collectively working together to improve all of our working conditions. I am but one, all I can do is speak from my experience. And I think one of the first instances where I really started to question my own morals and ethics on the job was deinstalling an art piece, which the Artman statement spoke a lot to the environment, to global warming, to how we have to do more to save the environment and save the planet. And I was literally throwing the entire artwork into a dumpster. And that's when I realized this isn't lining up. Certain things that are being said, the facade of things that aren't actually being practiced within the own institution. And I know for the gallery attendants whose job it is to take tours and inform the public on the exhibitions, they're having to basically recite a script about things like labor rights that maybe they themselves aren't even getting in their own job. So I know for them there was a lot of obvious hypocrisy happening. And essentially what we did was just hold our own employers to their own statements and mandates, apply it in-house as well as outside. So, yeah.
What was the response of the rest of the membership when they heard the board resign? Were they surprised? Were people, what was the mood like?
The mood was, we knew something was wrong, obviously. Our working conditions weren't great. And as a technician, originally we were all departments were kind of siloed or separated from each other. And then once I started talking to some of the gallery attendants and started talking to some of the office staff, I realized that we all had the same problems. We were all, it was like a trickle-down effect that was happening, that was kind of permeating its way through the entire institution. And then once I realized we all had the same problems, I was like, oh, wow, this is why it's important to organize and talk to other departments within your workplaces, see what they're experiencing. And then from there, the response of the entire board resigning, it's like we knew it was bad, but we didn't know how bad. And then, then we find out, oh, the board is suing Harborfront and Harborfront's suing the board. And we're in the middle being like, what is going on? So we were just as surprised and shocked to everyone about it. But I'd also say the employers themselves were also surprised and shocked when we had a unanimous vote to unionize. They didn't see it coming. I think they definitely underestimated us and all of our work and how passionate we were about the work that we do. And I think they thought it was just a couple bad apples was the term I heard. So when we all 100%, or I think it was 99% unanimously vote to unionize, I think it was a real shock to both our managers and the director as well as the board. So they say it had nothing to do with the union, but I definitely believe that we were a catalyst for some really serious questions to start being asked, and also for accountability, because I don't think that was happening prior to us unionizing.
That's great. Yeah, and how on the accountability. Your story about the environmental piece reminded me when we were bargaining at the Gladstone, they had this Earth Day promo going on, and they were like, 9 out of 10 of our employees walk to work. And I said, hold on a minute. We're trying to get everyone a transit pass right now. We want that to stop. So, yeah. I'll go back to the AGO for a minute. So in response to their creative director, which was the first Indigenous woman in the role, showing her support for the Palestinian people, the AGO board not only terminated her, but actually scraped the Indigenous land acknowledgement she'd installed in the gallery off the wall, Louis, the piece that you have in the show here, which is on display just right here, is a representation of what remained after it was stricken from the wall. And then Megan, you read that land acknowledgement aloud at a 535 picket line during a rally to open the rally up. So maybe I'll go to each of you. What do you think about the dichotomy between kind of the face that the AGO shows to the public and how they're, treating both the artists and the workers there? Megan, maybe we'll start with you and then I'll go to Louis.
Yeah, so Wanda was the, you say creative director, it's okay, I'll forgive you.
Yeah, thank you.
Canadian and Indigenous curator. So she was the first curator to be the Indigenous curator of the collection, but she also worked on Canadian artwork as well. Yeah, so obviously it was a massive shock to all of us when it happened. I'm sure, as you all know, the AGO is not really, transparency and the AGO don't really go hand in hand, or even just communications. They've been silent during this whole strike. They've never released a single statement, which has made my life a lot easier, so thank you. Yeah, it was horrible as an installer because Wanda was one of those folks who was not only, an Indigenous curator, finally Anishinaabe in our space, but just like a really nice working class human being and just really enjoyable to work with, and felt so comfortable working on shows with her that it was horrible. Now, the statement, yes, it was taken down by the AGO, but I also think Wanda wanted it taken down because they had broken their promise. That was one of the last things that Wanda did with her colleague Georgiana, and they asked the installers to scrape it off the wall, and the installers did save it, and it's hidden in someone's office right now. So hopefully it's still there when we get back. But we knew that it was going to be bad because Takerlik, who was our brand new Inuit curator, also decided to leave. Understandably, and our other Indigenous assistant curator, Emily, had also found another job. So now, between October and November, we were without any Indigenous members of the leadership in curatorial, and there was no path forward. There was no certainly no reconciliation, and it was obvious. I went through old articles from 2016 in the Toronto Star that literally say, Wanda is a part of the Idle No More movement, has always been pro-Palestine. Of course, an Indigenous woman is against colonization and genocide. What a fucking surprise. It was just so ridiculous. And I know even at that moment, our workers were already hankering for a fight. With their own issues, with the clear fakeness of the institution. And every subsequent town hall that happened with the director, Stefan Yost, afterwards was just so brutally fake. And they could never answer anything. And now they're working on a very restrictive social media policy that potentially infringes on the individual's rights to free speech under the Human Rights Code. So I look forward to also challenging that when they decide to finally table that. But yeah, it was a nail in the coffin for us. We knew that they are just these folks are tokens for this institution.
Thanks, Megan. Louis.
Yeah, it's a brutal situation. So Wanda Nanibush was hired as Indigenous curator at the AGO of what was then the Canadian Art Department, the Department of Canadian Art. And through her work, they changed it to the Department of Indigenous and Canadian Art, which is, if you could think about what that means, that's a huge change and a commitment on the part of the organization to rethink its relationship. And the photograph that I have here is my hand pointing at the traces of an erased text on the wall. You can barely see it in the image. And that wall had the mandate of that new department, of the Indigenous and Canadian Art Department. It had the mandate which was premised on this treaty relationships and nation-to-nation relationships, right? And it's great that you pointed out that the removal of the text is, I think, an act of protest on the part of Wanda and Georgiana that because of the situation and the conditions in which Wanda was forced to leave, they can no longer pretend to live by this mandate. I volunteer on the committee of the Department of Indigenous and Canadian Art, so it's quite intense. Like when you talk about the fakeness and the kind of town halls, the dominating silence and the refusal of people to speak or to let me speak is astounding. Like, it's amazing kind of what a deeply held culture there is at a certain level of that organization. Having said that, the actual workers of the organization have a totally different idea, like a fundamental belief in this vision of things, which the organization was benefiting from. Like, I mean, like literally something like 2 weeks before Wanda departed, as they like to call it, she was awarded an award for her latest book titled Moving the Museum. So the organization is getting a lot of glow from her labor, from her ideas, her advocacy, her activism. And as long as it's convenient, they'll happily kind of take it. But the moment she becomes like inconvenient, any of that can be like gotten rid of, backtracked, erased. It's astounding to see that. You mentioned this, so they've organized a task force to come up with policy around freedom of speech, which I think it's a very dangerous containment of what's actually the problem. The actual problem is like harassment of AGO staff and the leadership getting rid of the staff to support the harasser. As well, I also think the issue is donor influence in these actions. But to make it as a freedom of speech thing is a way to not talk about these real issues that have now come to light. So I think it's a very dangerous containment, and very cynical also that they're foregrounding as many Black people in the organization to become the kind of fig leaf, the moral fig leaf of this task force. So the way in which they're pitting Black people and against Indigenous people is sick. It's really so cynical. And we have to make sure that doesn't fly.
Yeah.
Megan, did you have something you wanted to add? I saw your microphone shoot up for a second, but.
I think you're probably going to ask a bit more about donors, because I can, it's very funny. The joke I always tell people is that I work at the Art Gallery of Ontario, the province's leading money laundering institute. And we did some research the other night, and a lot of people don't realize this, but you have the Art Gallery of Ontario, and it has its board and its trustees, but you also have the Art Gallery Foundation with its board and its trustees. So often people use foundations, if you know a bit about how capital works, you use foundations like your savings account. So that's where you hide money so you don't get capital gains tax. And of course, when you already have the richest Canadians using the AGO to donate artwork, every time they donate artwork, it's not benevolency, it's a tax write-off. So I think I'm allowed to say this. During our 15-hour bargaining session on Wednesday with the employer, where they walked away, they asked us as a union if we would go to the government with them in a joint committee or something and ask for more money. And I thought that was very interesting because I had just looked at the financial statements of the AGO, and even though they say, and it is on paper true, that they're in a $5 million deficit, at the same time, the AGO donated to the AGO Foundation millions of dollars. I don't know how I know how that works. That's just how capitalism works. That's how you make money move. So that means all the assets in the AGO Foundation are liquid, which means they have money. That's all you need to know. And because they need to go to the government to ask for more money for the funding, that means to me as a taxpayer that the richest are still not paying enough taxes to fund the public arts museum. And that's not just our institution, that's all institutions. That's even small institutions and the grants they use to operate. So it's very obvious to me that when they use our Indigenous communities and our Black communities for these token ways to get more money from the government, and then they throw them under the bus and get rid of them, as you say, as soon as they're inconvenient. But the money is there, and the money is always been there, because if you look at the wealthiest Canadians, the line is going up for them, and for the rest of us, it's going down. So it's just been a really aggravating moment for me, looking at these arts, cultural institutions crying poor, but then still locking arms with the wealthiest Canadians. And it's like you're kicking yourself in the face with that. These are not the people that are actually supporting the arts. These are the people using the arts to launder their money so they can get better tax returns. But anyways.
Thanks, Megan. If it's all right with the panel, I'll go off script for a moment because this is a great topic. You know, it's funny, we're talking about the image, the progressive image that these institutions like to put forward, which we've just talked about how it's pretty self-evidently not true. You know, I'd contrast that with the image that labor unions and other kind of political organizations have in our popular culture as these very stodgy, repressive, kind of old boys club institutions, some of which is certainly true. But, you know, we're seeing time and again, whether it's at the power plant or the AGO, you know, it's the workers and the artists who are standing up for the progressive values that these institutions put forward. And I'd say something similar is happening in other sectors. The Ontario Teachers Pension Plan just recently held its big annual investors forum.
That was supposed to be at the AGO, but we got it moved.
I had heard that. But they held their big investors forum, and teachers who are they pay into this fund, were said, hold on a minute, this is our money. We don't like that you're using it to invest in weapons and arms manufacturing and sale. And, you know, it's them who are fighting tooth and nail to move this institution. Why do you think it is that image of kind of political and labor movements still has this old, stodgy vision of it projected out to the people, when it's actually them that are really trying to move the needle on kind of progressive politics, both for working people and for the whole society? Yeah, Louis.
Because it's useful. You know, the moment you prevent people from organizing, they can't organize. And so if you make it appear that organizing is stodgy, annoying, boring, who cares, it's very useful. Just like a romantic idea of an artist who's like this kind of self-flogging, you know, whatever, that's very convenient. So all of these things go by the name of ideology, right? So this is something that as a teacher, I'm trying to address in my classes at U of T. So it's very interesting to kind of like try to see what ways we can address these existing ideological images of the artist, the worker, the strike, the union, whatever we want to refer to, and how these existing dominant ideas or impressions we have actually are counteracting to your own shared interests. And, you know, what other kind of images or histories or knowledges can we tap into that also exist in the same society? They're just not as dominant or readily available. But yeah, these ideas are very convenient.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, not dominant because people who control the media and things like that would prefer that they not be.
Which is why I think like the arts have a role to play in kind of like addressing existing ideologies embedded in images, embedded in words, embedded in the form of things, the architecture of the world we live in. And so to think of the artist's role as kind of having, I think of it almost as acupuncture. Like you try to find kind of what are the nerve points of your existing ideological system that you're in, and you try to find out, you know, what's the one little thing I can touch to activate a whole nerve center. Yeah. Conceptual art, I think, is really interesting for that reason. Like, I think conceptual art has really tried to think about artistic practice not as self-expression, not as those kind of romantic ideas, but open up different possibilities. As we were talking, I was thinking about General Idea, this artist collective of Canadian artists, and they had a video, very ironic, where they're like, but I'm an artist. I'm not supposed to even see money, and that's a way to talk about something. It's really a way to like get over it. It's not helping. So yeah, I think to think about kind of to follow the money in a sense, to think of whose interests are being served, whose interests are not being served, for whom is this existing way of doing things convenient, for who's paying the price of that. Once to start to kind of, in quotes, follow the money, then things start to get very interesting to understand kind of how things work and, our shared role to play in that.
Thanks, Louis. Vanessa, Megan, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just thinking about narratives, thinking about people who have the money to invest in controlling narratives. So if someone has a reputation for being a terrible employer who treats all their staff like shit and the entire staff walk out on the job, they essentially have the means to, pay a journalist to write a fluff piece about them in the Toronto Star about their wardrobe or their personal art collection at home, to kind of counter what maybe the word on the street is. And, it's funny because in tech, techs talk to other techs. We're a small group of people in the city. We all work at various different locations. So we talk to each other about our experiences, what it was like working at this institution versus another. So you start to hear of like bad places, you kind of steer clear from them. So I'm always a little skeptical when I see kind of these articles being written that redirect the narrative or paint unions in a bad light. And I think about when we motioned to vote for unionization at the power plant, I think we kind of caught our employers off guard, and they sent out this like desperate email to all staff the day before the vote to try to encourage us not to vote the union. And it was such a performative email. It was saying things like, the union will prevent us from advocating for you. And the
We're
whole
a family.
point was, you aren't. Yeah. Oh, we're a family. We won't be able to. You won't be able to benefit from the perks of the job when there were no perks. So it and in fact actually swayed more people to vote, because the people who were on the fence, once they got that email, they were like, oh, I'm voting union. So it actually helped us in the end. But I think about this narrative of unions are gross or it's like unfashionable. It's kind of like a fad, but they're in fads that changes constantly. And I think we're seeing a change happening right now.
Thanks, Vanessa. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, the boss is always the best organizer, really. They do their job for you. Megan, anything you wanted to add?
A lot of the stuff that we're talking about is actually, if you all know the artist Heater Steyrel, she has a fantastic book with essays called Wretched of the Screen. And she talks a little bit about that. So if you're curious about that topic, go down that rabbit hole. It's really good. But I think it also reminded me, it wasn't me as an individual, not at all. It's always a group of folks. We tried to organize MOCA, and it failed. And there's many reasons why it failed that it could have done better, but the employer always does such a good job of like running the gambit. And it was hard to explain to people, even other installers that I'd worked with, because it was actually the installers that busted that vote, which is strange because when you're an art installer, it's one of the true jobs that you get where you do work as a collective, that you have to trust everyone because you might get squished by a 2,000-pound crate if you don't work together. That sometimes your idea isn't the best idea and you have to submit to the better idea to make the thing move forward. And it truly is one of the best teams that I've ever worked in. Like, I absolutely love being an installer, and my crew is big reason why I was able to do so much organizing at the Archive of Ontario, because it's full-timers acknowledging the precarity of the younger folks coming in and knowing that those younger folks need to take over their jobs and create that succession planning and that legacy. So I always feel very fucking lucky that I get to be with those people. But you also were talking about like the rich control of art, one of my second jobs at the Archive of Ontario is working in the vaults and the collections. So I get to see all the art that's coming in that's being selected to be maybe bought and go into the collection. We get so much cool political art and it never gets accepted. You'll never see it because it goes through a committee and the committee rejects it because oftentimes the people on that committee are the wealthiest individuals and it hurts their narrative and it hurts their platform and they can't accept it. So it's not like curators aren't trying all the time to make the institution a bit more radical. They try all the time. They just get shot down all the time. But yeah, I think with like bringing new folks into the organization, I think that's how we flex our power. And that's why we were so happy when the power plant joined us, because y'all are very small. And I think you need the bulk of the AGO to really help you when that time comes to flex that movement of walking out when you're not being treated well. So that's also why we wanted MoCA to join us, because we wanted MoCA to have that same power. But yeah, anyways.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, everyone. So we've been talking a lot about exploitation, kind of that increase in exploitation. So, as profitability has kind of steadily declined over the 20th century, capital has been forced to institute counter mechanisms in order to boost its profitability back up. So exploitation is one way to increase your profits. We've discussed it from one angle, but one I wanted to hear about, one I was curious about, is the element that de-skilling plays. So one of the main bargaining sticking points at the AGO is contracting out. So often these subcontractors are lower paid, lower skilled workers who the company will farm out to in kind of a race to the bottom. I'll start with Megan and Vanessa. What impact has contracting out and this de-skilling had in your workplaces? What are the effects that it has on the industry as a whole?
I'll start because I find this kind of an interesting topic because, this was something that we wrote into our collective agreement. But we did acknowledge that contracting out is necessary in certain contexts. Like you shouldn't have a new just trained tech doing electrical. You need to contract out a certified electrician for that job. And that's also for health and safety reasons. So there are moments where contracting out makes sense for the whole betterment of everyone, the institution and the workers. But then it comes to the point where I think there was a sense of disillusionment that happened because there is a general sense of, contracting out cheaper labor. But I actually find, in fact, contractors cost more. So they thought they could replace staff to do certain things like mudding or painting. But then they find out once they contacted these contractors, they're in fact paying twice as much. And by all means, if they want to contract out someone to mud all day long for 2 weeks straight, I'm not crying about it. I would rather focus on art handling and working with the artists and doing the skills that I'm certified to do. But then when it came to the institution, I think they realized they were now spending twice as much money contracting out and reflecting on that, being like, oh, wow, we were actually getting quite a good deal with our in-house technicians doing all that work. And there's something to say about that, like institutional knowledge of knowing a building, knowing which wall likes to crack every 3 months and how to fix it. Whereas you bring a contractor in, you might never see them again. They don't know the space. They don't have an understanding of the artwork. So then you run into problems where, the contractors might think something's garbage when in fact it's part of the artwork. And next thing you know, they drop a piece. Hopefully they have their own insurance because they might not be covered by the institution's insurance. So there's a lot of little cracks to fall into there that I personally am not too worried about right now, at least. But I did have to defend the tech department because there is an issue with devaluing that sense of we can find someone else when I know you in fact can't, because I have all these certifications. I have working in heights. I have my lift ticket. You can't exactly find someone off the street who can go up into a skyjack and start, using airline cable to properly to suspend a structure that's going to be over people walking around. So there's a lot of health and safety ramifications to when you're outsourcing the job. I think that's my point.
Yeah, so de-skilling also works. I often say it starts in the job description. So with your job description, our manager de-skilled us by taking out words that were very beneficial to our job. So that means that now I can never seek, or we can never seek another classification. So the AGO, we have pay tiers. It's like A, A1, A2, A3, B, 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 C, blah, blah, blah. And so sometimes what you can do, because of the way the union works, you can set up a sort of committee that evaluates jobs, and it's joint. So it's between worker and management. It often doesn't go anywhere because that's what happens when you have equal parts. Like it just stagnates because no one can like win the vote. Essentially, if you have 3 workers and 3 managers, they can just say, I disagree, and then it doesn't go anywhere. Management's rights. It's management's rights to decide what your job is. But your manager, in my experience in the museum industry, my manager doesn't like art. So not sure how he got the job, but he's also never done it. He's never installed art. So he de-skilled us by taking words out of our job description that actually are the reason why we're so niche and important and unique. And so then that sort of stops you from ever being able to try to get a raise because your job description is so basic. And then with contracting out, what we're looking for is the full-time staff have a contracting out clause. Regular part-time staff have a tiny bit of coverage in that clause, and all the other part-time staff don't. Because at the AGO, we have occasional part-time, which I've been for over 7 years, and some of my coworkers have been occasional part-time for almost 30 years. They're different. They might just want to be occasional part-time for 30 years. And then we have temporary part-time, and then we have regular part-time. So we have stratification within the part-time section already. So what we're looking for is to unify the collective agreement so it actually has true equity and equality for all workers. So we want the same protections that full-time workers have. And to Vanessa's point, you can still contract out. I don't have my electrician certificate. I don't want to, that's not for me. I get that. But I mean, also if the AGO is doing so much electrical work all the time, then why not have an electrician on staff? Like it seems pretty easy to me. And it also is always cheaper. Like it might have a short-term gain, but it has a long-term loss. So that's what we're fighting for in our institution, at least.
Just to add to that, yeah, like it's always about the bottom line. You hear them talking about the bottom line. We don't have the money. We don't have the money. But then there's like the onboarding, the retraining of staff when people are leaving, and you have to put all that money and work and effort into retraining staff or re-educating contractors who are coming in. That's also time and money. And I don't understand why that never seems to be a factor.
Yeah, I think something I saw too at the Gladstone, we had a very small AV department, and the company insisted after we had finished bargaining, they were like, no, we've got new technology, it's plug and play. And I was like, hold on a minute, are you telling me I'm going to do it? No, don't worry, the manager will do it, it's fine. And over COVID, most of our AV techs had moved on anyways. So they closed that department. But then what they ended up doing is just contracting out the work for, I think, $50 an hour or something ridiculous like that, which was, I think, almost double of the wage that we were proposing originally in the contract. And what you see is they're happy to spend more. And not always that's all going to the worker. The subcontracting company is taking a lot of that. But they're happy to spend more often to just weaken the strength of the workers as a whole. If you bring new people in every time, it's harder to unionize. It's harder to make a union project strong. And it's harder to have those organizing discussions reflected in Liam's work, like you were talking about, Louis, that happen on the shop floor. Louis, I want to go to you, and I want to kind of approach it from a different angle. How do you see the effects of de-skilling, subcontracting? How does it impact the industry from an artist perspective? Does it impact shows, relationships artists normally have with institutions? What's your thoughts on this?
Can I take this question from like a skewed angle?
Please do.
Okay, because the question of de-skilling, super important as we're hearing. And it also has a very different sense in art historical terms. And so I'd like to kind of approach it from that. I don't know how that adds up, but I think it's interesting to consider. So art historically, there's a question about kind of artistic de-skilling. So the kind of moving away from an idea of like the uniqueness of the artist's touch, like only Rembrandt could paint like Rembrandt, only Goya could draw like Goya, to a de-skilling. Anybody could do it, right? And so a lot of the history of modern art, a significant chunk of it has dealt with this idea of like, no, it's not about the uniqueness of the artist touching this thing in a specific way. Anybody could do it, and that's the point. So that's been called de-skilling, and it leads to conceptual art and other forms. So interestingly, I think de-skilling understood art historically, not exactly in the ways that we're talking about in job descriptions and contracting, has opened the way for artists to break out of these kind of romantic ideas, and open up the possibility for art to engage questions of systemic questions, political questions, questions of like, how are things organized? If we don't have to kind of live according to this fantasy of the artist as romantic subject with this unique touch, if anybody could do it, suddenly the role of the artist opens up in so many other directions where you can, for example, think about funding, think about what the relationship is to the institution, to the labor conditions, the environmental conditions, things like that. So I wanted to kind of offer that as I don't know how that adds up, but it's an interesting counterpoint in which the same term is active in different ways in the same, I don't know, social field.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was great. I was gonna follow up with a question. I think because Megan, you touched on it a bit. Why not just hire an electrician if we've got all this electrical work? You all come at it from different kind of perspectives, working in these sorts of institutions. You know, what would you see like a healthy institution? What would that reflect? Megan, that's something you're thinking of right now while you're bargaining. And Vanessa, you recently went through the same thing. Louis, I'd be curious to know what's an institution you want to show in? What's an institution you want and work at as a teacher? So maybe can we go from there?
I mean, yeah, I think you can tell that it was tried in our union. So there's something called rollover hours, which is you've worked so many hours, so you roll over into a full-time. You have the opportunity to roll into a full-time job because not everyone wants to be full-time. That's fine. But you should have the opportunity, if you want it, to take it. And what happens then is then you're scheduled always just a little less than the rollover hours. And you can try to change the language so your rollover hours are less, but then what do you think happens? Then they schedule you for a little bit less than that number. So we're really working with this problem of like, how do you resolve that how do you convince an employer that you are worth it, that you're willing to do that? And I don't think you can. I think you have to force them. There is no asking nicely anymore. The AGO's made that obviously really apparent with all of their actions over the past few years, that you have to demand it and hold their feet to the fire and get that done. So yeah, we're still trying to resolve like what that looks like, but it really always is pushing for more stability, pushing for more respect in whatever way the workers feel that. Like it's always about the collective. So my individual ideas of how to get there are sort of null. It's about how does everyone else in that workplace view it. But we always organize from the bottom up. So you're not going to ask people who have never been precarious. We have plenty of folks in our union right now that voted to accept the employer's deal. But we have over 60% precarious and part-time workers at the AGO, and that number has increased every year since the 90s. You know, you only have 10% and then 20%, and then it goes on. So then what happens when you're all gig workers, essentially, for a museum? So you ask the most vulnerable, you ask the most marginalized what they see for themselves in this workplace, what they need, and that's what you bargain for. So I'm in a position where I have, someone else right now during the strike who's making money. So I'm okay, but there's many people that are not. So it's asking for what they need because they will help raise the tide so that all the boats can float.
Thanks, Megan. Vanessa, any thoughts?
Yeah, I always think of, in terms of the most marginalized in the workplace, I know for the power plant, it was the gallery attendants. And similarly, even though we got a contract, it's our first contract, so it's not perfect. And by no means is it like everything's fixed now. No, it's a starting point to then build up from. And that was something that we really had to talk to our membership about, and tell them like, this isn't going to fix everything overnight, but it's a starting point. And even then, even though we put in measures and things that we thought would protect us workers, the employment can find loopholes, little things such as like tiers of pay grade. As a gallery attendant, they'll book you for just under the hour you would need to, say, qualify for benefits and stuff like that. So they keep you right under the limit that you would need in order to like thrive in your workplace. Things like talking about the institution as a stepping stone, which was a response that I heard used a few times about, well, the reason why we have the lowest wage for technicians in all of Ontario is because this is just a job that you get for a little while and then you move on and then you go get a real job. Like that's the way that they were talking about our profession, and this sense of like, well, maybe I don't want to go somewhere else. Maybe I want this job to be the job that I want in the future. I want to embed where I am. And that was kind of the crossroads that I came to as a senior technician, seeing so many great technicians leave because of various different reasons, all understandable. I had that moment of, do I just quit and leave? And then I always had that saying of like, leaving the campsite better than you found it. Yeah. And I kind of stick to that. I guess it's my like early scout training of but I was like, if I just quit and leave, it's not going to do anything. There's going to be no change. And then the younger generation is going to come in and get further exploited. So that's kind of when, for me, and talking to the GAs and talking to the office staff made me realize, collectively, we are the thing that makes this run. Without one department, none of the departments could do their job. And I think that's partially why they kept us all kind of segregated, because at the root of any union is a community. So you have to, at the base level, begin with creating a community, knowing who your coworkers are, getting to know them outside of the institution, and having these types of conversations of what would it take for you to stay in this job instead of looking elsewhere and moving on. So I think that's in part with the pandemic, with lockdown. A lot of the gallery attendants were, like, I think, mishandled. Their income suddenly evaporated, and the institution didn't help them, didn't educate them on how to even apply for EI and things like that. So a lot of our gallery attendants were suddenly put into very precarious situations of not being able to afford rent, not being able to eat at the end of the day. And it came up to us workers banding together to educate each other, how to help each other, and then given all that extra time to then organize. So I think the pandemic created a space for us to do that. You know, we were on Zoom calls every other week all together as a group. And then also the pandemic highlighted a lot of, for me personally, health and safety issues that were being neglected. It just became so obvious we couldn't ignore it anymore. So that was kind of the beginning spot for that. Yeah.
Louis?
I keep thinking about the Zoom calls and as kind of places where like knowledge is transmitted and a certain kind of ethics, like an ethos of working together is transmitted. I'm paying attention to those forms of transmission and those moments where transmission happens. That there's no like textbook for, there's no institution that will teach you those things. There's a kind of lived way of transmitting stuff. So anyway, it's something I've been thinking about a lot. But also, like, hearing you both speak, I keep thinking about like this idea of like being kept just under that level at which your situation would improve and you can thrive, and just keep being kept a little bit under. You know, we talked about ideology and kind of like the idea that, organizing and labor organizing, that's boring and whatever. Capitalism is exciting and dynamic. You know, one of the ideological fantasies of capitalism is that it produces value by innovation, by making things more efficient, more innovative. But in fact, it's doing it precisely by shaving off. Like it can't improve anything, can only destroy something to squeeze value. So this act of kind of being kept just under is part of that. And so I think it's extremely important to think about capitalism in relation to colonialism, which I think is what Wanda's work was trying to like get at. What Marx, like colonialism understood as what Marx called like primitive accumulation. Like you make value literally by just stealing your shit, like I didn't create anything. I'm not getting wealthy because I'm a genius or I can do something better than you. I get away with theft, and that's called colonialism. And so making that that idea that this thing that we call innovation and this dynamic excitement, it's actually not that. It's shaving off. It's making value by shaving off of people's ability to thrive. And the more we can kind of grasp that thought and think about how that applies in our relationships and everyday environments, and how we can imagine other ways of doing things. And there are like existing sources of knowledge for that. There are existing sources of transmission for that. The labor movement, I think, being a really important space in which those forms of transmission happen. I think queer culture is a very interesting space where like very interesting forms of transmission happen in situations where basically your life is not supposed to happen, feminism, same thing, anarchism. So there are many things that we can tap onto that are conduits for other ways of being. And ways of relating with each other. And as an artist, that's what I'm really trying to pay attention to and kind of like connect the dots that way. So how do I envision an institution working? I think institutions I like to see them as sites of antagonism, right? Any institution is a site of conflict. The convenient version of that for the institution is to see itself as conflict-free, right? And to make you believe that it's conflict-free. If we see it as conflict-free, that means a domination is happening, right? Like if we see it as peaceful and conflict-free, that means that domination is ruling, right? The moment that we see the curator at odds with the donor, the installer at odds with the artist, the messy reality of things, the moment that's allowed to be visible, that's healthy. That's actually a possibility where real needs can be negotiated. The moment we see like peace as like the desirable thing and the normal thing and the strike being the exception, I think that's when we accept that domination just has a right to our lives. So as destabilizing and awful as needing to strike and organize is, it makes visible the real situation. And that, I think, has a lot to teach us.
Because it's not really peace, really, it's censorship,
Exactly.
And I thought about it a little more. First start, your board members should be artists, curators, people from the community, other folks. It shouldn't be wealthy people that literally don't care about art. Like, that would be a great starting point for the AGO, I think, anyways. But
New demands for the contract.
next contract negotiation, yeah.
So this is a good jumping off point because we've talked a lot about how your unique perspectives as people who are artists and work in the arts kind of industry it seems like it's influenced a lot your political kind of direction and your organizing work, how you choose to communicate. I'm curious to know, how does it reflect back into your practice as artists? What sort of energy does kind of your political activity bring to the work that you do? And what do you hope to kind of accomplish or achieve with that work? Because I imagine it's not a one-way street, right? If you're out in the streets every day, it's going to impact the things that you choose to create and show to people. So I'm curious to know what you think about that, if anyone wants to jump in.
I haven't made art in a long time because I've been organizing. But I used to make art, and I think about it all the time. So there's like a backlog of art pieces that I want to make. Being on strike, definitely I was thinking a lot about surveillance. We're surveilled right now by an outside company that's called Profile, and they have cameras and they watch us every day on strike, but they also come and intimidate us or aggravate us or bait us to say really strange things. And we had a rally on Saturday with labor leaders from across the province, and this one guy decided he'd try to interrupt it from Profile because we were standing on the AGO steps. He did not win. But so I've thought a lot about that. And then I remembered this like really beautiful piece, and please forgive me, I can't remember the artist's name, but when Standing Rock protests were happening, they were being surveilled by overhead drones. So an artist made these beautiful shields made out of mirrors. So the drone was reflected back at itself. And I keep waking up at 5 a.m. lately, and I'm not a morning person. I am a night owl. But I've been waking up at 5 a.m. and I was like researching. I was like, do I have enough time before I go to the strike line to try to get stick on mirror stuff? I was going to make this like mirrored outfit and just like follow those security guards around all the time. But even when I was working in the gallery, my background is mainly photography and film. I still shoot on my giant 4x5-inch film camera when I have a chance, and I just think a lot more institutional critique pieces, a lot more about labor, like what we do. We had the Henry Moore sculptures, and we covered the Henry Moore sculptures in plastic, and there's a skylight in that gallery, and it just was so ghostly and so beautiful, and remember taking photographs of that. So I definitely think just a lot more about like how our labor works in the institution. One piece that I really want to make one day is just for art installers. I want to make art just for art installers because we're freaks. And it was going to be a Russian nesting doll crate piece, where each crate has different hardware to open, like you different ways. Because yeah, and it starts off this big and it's really, really small. Because sometimes when you get like a multi-crated show and you're like, oh, this one has this, oh, this one has this, and you've all the equipment under the sun there to do the show. Anyway, so I think I want to make work for other workers is basically what the dream is now.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking about my own work that I do, and I guess since graduating OCAD, I was in drawing and painting, but I've led this very multidisciplinary practice, which is also adjacent to my work as a freelance contract trades worker, art installer, carpenter. I've been part of organizing for a very long time, and I'd say like as soon as I graduated OCAD, organized live work studio spaces, collectives, trying to carve out an affordable studio space within the city is a job within itself. So for years I managed and organized different studio spaces, and then from there a lot of my work tends to be very socially informed. I used to do this project called Night Lifeguard, which was like a safer space project where I would go to the pools at night when everyone was pool hopping, and then I would be the the night lifeguard, basically kind of encouraging the sense of, during a heat wave in Toronto, people need to swim, and this idea of water being free and the need to bathe and to relieve yourself shouldn't be something that has a 9 to 5 hour based on it. And then from there, that led me to work with festivals, art festivals, just being that person to look out for people's well-being, but in a performative kind of interactive way, not becoming an authority, but being the liaison between the festival goers and the security guards and stuff like that, how to make safety fun, And then from there, I was living in a work-live building called the Coffin Factory, which 5 years ago we were all evicted from. And then through there, I ended up organizing with the tenants there, and we held a funeral for our building, which at the time I didn't really think of as an art piece, but it kind of fell into this sense of creating social art awareness, how to bring people together to something to like grieve a building, like an arts building that's housed artists, musicians, filmmakers for 30, 40, 50 years, and suddenly that's just gone, and the city kind of glazing over that. In the everyone's toting around what do you call it, progress, right? I was once called anti-progress, which I was like, wow, that's really interesting. I never thought about that before. But then it's like, but what about community and how it affects people, that grieving process? So I feel like I fell into the organizing of the union because I was already in my own practice doing that kind of organizing and talking to people. So my work practice is kind of turned, and suddenly through unionizing, meeting Megan, and then also being trained on the bargaining committee in things like negotiations, mediation, suddenly it's opened up this whole new realm that I've actually never considered before. I have a knack for it. So I'm like, oh, maybe this is something else that I could bring into my own personal practice. And even if it means just working for the community, like something like I think about the new graduates at OCAD. How are they able to afford a studio space in the city? How is it even possible now? So these are the kind of things that I think about in terms of my practice and my organizing and how they're kind of blending together.
Hearing your question, I was thinking about this artist, Carol Ader. She's a West Coast artist in BC, kind of part of the 60s, 70s generation. She's one of the founders of the Western Front, this important artist-run center. And at one point she was interviewed and she said, like a lot of what I do is I do administrative work. Like I write the grants and I patch the walls for our next show and like I clean the toilet and like I help run an artist-run center. And people ask me like, well, but doesn't that take you away from your work as an artist? And she's like, no, patching the wall, writing the grant, doing the admin work, that is my work as an artist. And I love that category of being an artist because it's so flexible. It doesn't have like a preset. Just to more directly answer your question, I'm preparing for lean times. So I'm definitely making a choice to make my art be very cheap, and that I have to be able to continue it even if I get zero support for it. So I'm definitely kind of like, that's my focus. And I'm returning to like work that I was doing when I was a baby. Like I started with zines. Like I got introduced to art culture from making zines in high school. So photocopy publications. And so that's what I'm gonna do. I'm collaborating with my nephew, my 12-year-old nephew, Rio. And we're gonna launch our zine next month. So it's called I Am Full of Holes. And in a way it's talking about some of these things, about these kind of forms of transmission, how kind of ethos is passed around through community, and how that develops into a politics. Parker has agreed we're going to carry I Am Full of Holes here at Pumice Raft and at other locations. It's going to come out once a month. It's free of charge. So I encourage all of you to like keep visiting Pumice Raft. They do amazing exhibitions all the time. There's always interesting stuff happening here. So keep coming back. And if you do, pick up a copy of I Am Full of Holes. For me, like as a response to this, and it's a political decision as well, my work has to fit my conditions of life. And so if I see a kind of extended period of poverty and shortage of means, I can't pretend otherwise. So I'm just gonna have to like go with that. But it also activates other potentials. Like it does activate connecting with initiatives like Parker's space here, the Plum, on and on. So these are not just only pragmatic decisions, they also activate other relationships and other ways of being. So I've been thinking a lot about kind of like what shapes me, like what's made me who I am, and what are the communities specifically that have kind of created like a net that have carried me. Like when I was like a teenager, when I was 20, when I was 25, when I was 35. Like I see these nets that have made me exist and survive things. And through being held in these nets, they taught me stuff. You know, I was part of the anarchist free school that we started like in 1999. And I remember, so we met weekly to start this free school. And just about when we were about to launch, one of the organizers is like, hey, if we're gonna do a free school, we better know how to like facilitate group discussions. So I'm gonna do this workshop to like a kind of group facilitation workshop one weekend. So I attended, it changed my life. I still apply it. In my teaching, I still apply those lessons. And at the end of that weekend, I remember he said, I learned this from the dykes at the Body Politic magazine. And so I was like, what an important postscript. It's like he's letting me know, okay, here are some skills, here's some knowledge, but I'm letting you know where it comes from. And it doesn't necessarily come from this milieu, it could come from a different milieu, but it's being passed on. And the implicit message is, you're gonna carry this to other milieux, so be aware of that. So the zine is gonna be about kind of these kinds of stories. So, and Rio is an amazing artist. So like, it's also amazing to see Rio kind of like express himself and kind of find ways to describe his weirdness and his skewed ways of perceiving what he needs to say. So I'm very excited about it. So hope you guys can check it out.
Thanks, Louis. We're talking about now the next generation. Yeah. Just as a quick, rapid fire final question, you're all very active organizers now. If you were to speak to someone who's just coming in to this field, into this space, just getting into school, what would you tell them? What do you wish you knew when you were coming in? And what do you wish you had done sooner, you know, as far as like standing up for your rights of other working people, you know, both inside and outside of the cultural space? Maybe just really briefly, I'll go down the line this way and then we'll go to questions from the audience.
So this is not an easy question to ask because I think it's such turbulent times. Sometimes I feel guilty as a teacher teaching people to enter a very turbulent life. I'm like, it's going to be really hard, you know? So, and I don't want to say that to a young person. I don't want to, but they get it. They also see it for themselves. So I think that people want honesty. So like, I do try to pay attention to what brought you here. And specifically, not so much what ideological fantasy brought you here about kind of, I'm going to be discovered. And, you know, I mean, we all have those things and that's fine. But there was also a certain bothersome something that brought you here. And I'm trying to kind of pay attention to that note in what you're expressing and to validate it and to see, like, I hear it, I see it. I see that what you're doing is trying to address something bothersome or lacking. And so for me, it's important to validate, not so much like everything's going to be great, but there's something real in what brought you here. And let's see if we can kind of get into that, whatever that might be. That sounds abstract, but honestly, I do try to do that as a teacher. Like I really do. And my students do recognize, oh, it's an unstable time and I'm unstable. Like, you know, my student actually who was here last night at the opening, at one point in our grad seminar this winter, she asked me, are you okay, Louis? And I'm like, oh shit, this is awful that a student has to ask their professor, are you okay? And I'm like, I am okay. We were talking about Wanda. Like we read Wanda's writing for the entire semester. So that was my commitment. I asked them also at the beginning of the seminar, this is what I've brought. I prepared a whole 4 months of being able to talk about Wanda. Now, that's what I care about. But that's not necessarily what you care about. So tell me, we can do it differently. They all wanted to do it this way. So, but it was very interesting for a student to feel the need to like ask me, like notice the bothersome thing inside me and make it real. I really valued that. Like I thought that there's something kind of important being educated on both ways. Yeah.
Thanks, Louis. Vanessa?
Yeah, that's a very large question. I guess talking to people coming up, same thing. I don't want to scare them and to run away from this as a job or a profession, even though it's a struggle and we do have to fight to advocate for ourselves. I inherently believe in the profession, so I want to fight for the professionalism of it. I don't want my skills to be devalued, nor my coworkers' skills to be devalued. So I guess for a lot of people coming up, it's just knowing your worth and not being afraid to have difficult conversations. And I would almost suggest to try to preemptively think of what problem might occur in the future and have conversations before they happen. And there's a certain amount of transparency and a certain amount of like relinquishing of pride a little bit, you know, like I'm not perfect. I will make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. But how do we compromise? How do we sit at a table and come up in good faith, something that works for everybody? And the skills that I've learned through negotiations and mediation have taught me so much, not just in the arts industry, working with various different artists, but also in my own personal life, how I'm able to, you know, basically navigate difficult situations. And I can only imagine the younger generation is most likely struggling, but through that is community. Like you were saying, these nets, like I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for the communities that I had coming up and being in the city, because the city is hard. And I think to the detriment of the community is this sense of competitivism that is very inherent in Toronto, which lends to also like a hoarding of information. This sense of, well, I'll find someone else to do your job if you won't do it, right? So then suddenly I'm going to want to hoard the skills that I have because I want to be the only person who's able to do this. But that goes against who I am as a person, as an artist. I love sharing. I love skill sharing. I like being like free public domain everything, because what you do with that knowledge will be so much different than what I do with that knowledge. And why should I see that as a competition? You know, this idea of like we're all fighting for crumbs, when really if we organize, we can all have a piece of the pie. So I think that's my main thing, is just to be transparent, have difficult conversations before the difficulties happen. And again, it's kind of like applying critique that you learn in school. You don't want to say to someone, I don't like your art, it sucks. There's nothing you can't do anything with that. You can't grow from that. They can't learn how to be better artists from that. So it's like learning how to give constructive criticism and finding compromise.
That's great. I love the analogy about the pie. That's great. Yeah. Megan?
Yeah, that's a big, heavy question. I think everyone has their own sort of timeline and route. Like I'm, as much as I wish, like, yes, this had happened earlier. I mean, even with organizing at the AGO and all, I don't think I was there yet. Like, I don't have that knowledge and the capacity, and it takes time. And that's like something that I say to my nibblings. I'm also very close with my nieces and nephews. And is like it takes a lot of time, and it takes time to build relationships. And that's what I learned with organizing is becoming friends and drawing these people into your community. But something I do wish I could go back and visit young Megan, which was when I had left the city because I had run out of money. So I graduated from art school, run out of money, went back to the farm and was very isolated there. It was very tough, but it is to never stop fighting, and that you can find positivity in that fight, and that it's worth it. But keep fighting is worth it, especially when you find like that, you know, those comrades in arms who will link arms with you and will fight with you, because the community of it is so important. I think once I shed myself of my individualism is when I truly felt healthier and better, that doing it for more than just me and more than my future, and doing it for my friends and the people that I love so much. And yeah, that it's okay to wear your heart on your sleeve, and that it's like you will get hurt, but you will find more people who love you back than who don't love you for what the work you do. So yeah, I think that's what I would say to young people, is that like it does take time, and waiting is hard, but like you'll figure it out and just keep fighting.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks to everyone on our panel. It was great. So we have some time for questions from the audience. I see a couple hands already. I'm going to pass this mic around. It's not going to play to the speaker, I don't think, but it's just so that we can get it for the audio recording. So just...
Everybody can boo if they want, but I have a mini question and then a statement. Mini question is, did you just come up with that pie analogy?
The pie analogy.
Yeah,
I've been thinking about it for a while, actually.
but that's yours.
I guess I'm sure someone else has said it.
That
It's
is
in the collective conscience.
that is
let's be
such
real.
a slay. Oh my god.
I'm
Yeah.
born and
That was
raised
good.
in Toronto, so I've always noticed this about, it's like a Toronto quality that I begrudgingly like have to deal with, but it is a really competitive city. You go to other cities and it's not as competitive, and
Yeah.
I've always thought of it like that pie, you
Yeah.
know?
I really I often come to like talks and panels and stuff. I often find it very hard to understand what's going on, especially if it's in academic settings. There's two ways that I can access information, which I just want to applaud you all for applying, which is humor and like metaphor, like visual representations of what you're talking about. And the one thing I was thinking is that I really like the way you were describing, both of you guys were describing like the cap and people being like kept down. And then Louis, when you were describing like whittling, I think those two metaphors really like stuck, because I was like, oh, you basically, the people on top are like pushing down and like thinning so that somebody becomes nothing and then has no feeling of like confidence to be like, I have rights, I have things that I need or whatever. You whittled down to nothing. And I also just wanted to comment that, Louis, you said your answer to the final question, you said, oh, that's really abstract. And I was like, no, it's fucking not. I was like, what you're talking about is insecurity. And when I think about that in a visual way, it's like something that's like got no bearings and is maybe flying out of control and no security. And what you're talking about is saying to somebody what is at the core of what you care about and why you would do that, and to like know that, remind yourself of that. And I think that's like a centering. You're talking about mental health. You're basically being like, yes, when you feel physically unhealthy, not well nutrition, not like secure, like when you feel mentally unhealthy, what is at the core of why you're doing what you're doing? I think that's incredibly practical. I don't think it's abstract at all.
I think it's a tactic to keep everyone hungry, because then everyone's desperate. And then if you're desperate, yeah, it's part of the cycle. And yeah, well, when you organize, then we all get more together. And that was just something that I feel like people don't really pay attention to when they accept, say, a job contract that undercuts the industry as a whole. You're not thinking about it that way. You're only thinking about yourself. Oh, I need to pay rent, so I'll just get whatever I can because I'm so desperate. But you have to ask yourself, why am I so desperate? What is keeping me so desperate? And how can we change that? And I think fundamentally, it's like when you start talking to your peers, you realize that we're all desperate and we're all struggling. And therein lies our power to collectively put our foot down and say, actually, no, what we do deserves more money. And they can't really do anything against that.
Thank you, panelists. That was a great talk. I was really interested in hearing about the idea of information sharing and what that means, and how, you know, people amongst marginalized communities, often it's like a verbal, you know, or like you talk to people and you learn more. But I guess my question is like, how can we more permanently record these things that we're learning, so that so future generations can make a historical analysis and understand the material conditions of what was happening in that time, and be able to learn from that and also apply it to their, you know, current situation. I mean, obviously something like the People's Voice is a good way to do that. Also zines, you know, like having that sort of like physical, that you're not just like being forced to remember it.
I have a really boring answer for you.
No, I want to hear it. Yeah. Thank you.
So when we were bargaining, the best thing you can do is go through all the old contracts that have ever been bargained. So the union at the AGO was started in the 70s. So it's like a 30-year-old union. So if you go through that collective agreement, you can see literally every new item that's come in and how it's changed. So for instance, one of the agreements we've just bargained for is a lot of our cleaning staff are Black women from the Caribbean. And I was like, wait a second. I was having conversations with them and I was like, wait, when does your shift start? They said this time. And I said, well, so the TTC's not running. Like the subway's not running. Oh yeah, I have to take this bus, then this bus, then this bus, then this bus. And I was like, okay, that's shitty. We're gonna bargain for taxi chits. So if your schedule starts at a certain time, you get a taxi chit. I want you to feel safe and comfortable and be able to do that work easier. So like you could literally, if you were putting the pieces together, I mean, the better thing for us to do would be to put the rationale and then log that. But that's how I was able to backtrack and see that was also how I was able to see that we were sort of sold out by some of our counterparts. Like the part-time, there was more and more concessions being given because they'd say, okay, you'll do this for the full-time and we'll just throw the part-timers under the bus. So that was an easy way to see concessions. You could line that up by looking at governments. Like, okay, what year was this? Like you can sort of do that historical knowledge. So the archive of the collective agreements was very useful and important. But I do think the addition would be to have the rationale. So then you don't have to do so much damn research because it takes hours to go through this stuff. But that was my concrete example.
Well, I know when we were unionizing at the power plant, none of us had unionized before, ever. So for all of us, we kind of started with this idea. We were all having the same conversation. Wouldn't it be great if, but then when it came down to action, we were like, well, how do you actually do that? And part of that was looking through other organizations that have unionized, not only in Canada, but also abroad. Like right now, there's a huge movement in multiple major galleries all over North America and Europe who are unionizing right now. So we literally just look to how they did it. Now there's subtleties within their laws and our laws, but what tactics worked, what didn't work, how they presented themselves online to the whole world, how did they make everyone feel involved, and then also reaching out and researching different unions, like which union should we go to. And that was a huge thing for our organizational committee for the union, was which union would best represent us. And that's when we looked to OPSU, who already represented the AGO, and we looked at their history and how they had striked. I think it was in the 80s or something like that. And we knew that they would understand the nature of our employment. And then that's when we reached out and got to talking through Zoom, was when we first met, and just passing on that knowledge and that history. And then, we all had our different strengths and weaknesses. So different people on the organization would take on different roles. And sometimes I would be just researching history. Here's how this institution did it. Here's how this one did it. And then contrast, compare, see what would work best for us. And then I would hope that one day also that we collectively could maybe write some of this stuff down, not only in our collective agreements, but just as us as people, what it was like to organize and to unionize, to make it so other people like me won't feel that dauntingness of going up against something so big. Like when your board has CEOs, ex-CEOs of banks and own their own law firms, it's incredibly intimidating. But collectively, you have strength and you have power. So it'd be nice to somehow get that out there. Maybe we should make a zine as well.
So your question was about how do we kind of record this and transmit knowledge? You're thinking about kind of this question of transmission. So one of the things reading Wanda's writing this semester, she writes a lot about sovereignty. And I've been asking myself, what does she mean by sovereignty? And I've been talking about it with my students. And one thing that she said at the end, she said, I've been thinking a lot about oral knowledge, and something is starting to click for me, kind of thinking about this question in terms of what's the difference between written knowledge and oral knowledge? Oral knowledge is like this. We're in the same room and we're communicating orally, and if I'm bullshitting, you can tell, right? Like if I'm not, you talked about the discrepancy between the values as they're projected and what an institution actually does. The oral form of doing things, because we're present, that discrepancy is part of the message, or whether it's discrepant or not is part of the message itself. As distinct from written knowledge, where I can type up this conversation, put it somewhere, and someone that has no relationship to us, to this place, to this event, to any of us, can have access to that knowledge. Now, that's awesome. That's great that can happen. But there isn't that kind of presence of being there with who has the knowledge, right? And, part of colonialism is to get rid of and cut and whittle and annihilate all forms of oral knowledge transmission on which communities depend, and substitute them by forms of written knowledge that keep people apart and disconnected from each other. One thing that I've been kind of trying to learn about is treaties, and what the difference is between a contract and a treaty. It's interesting, like if you think of a treaty as oral knowledge and a contract as written knowledge. I've been listening to lectures of these indigenous law scholars, Aaron Mills and a couple of other people. They explain, with a contract, it breaks the relationship, right? Interestingly, like if you and I have an agreement and we write down the agreement on the contract, in a way that paper breaks our relationship, right? So that if we disagree, we don't have to talk to each other. We just look at what the paper says. And so it's a very interesting way in which the written knowledge actually breaks human relationships. Treaties, on the other hand, from an indigenous law perspective, the idea is it's not a contract. It's what they call polishing the chain, right? Like a chain, an agreement, a relationship will get rusty. So what you have to do is you have to revisit that relationship over and over and over and over again. So the treaties that we talk about in terms of like land claims and things like this, they weren't contracts, and they were definitely not land sales of property. They were treaties understood as we're gonna now enter into a relationship. And what that means is we're gonna have to get together every year and polish the chain, which means you're gonna have to describe how you remember the agreement. I'm gonna have to describe how I remember the agreement. And any discrepancy, we're gonna have to figure it out over and over and over again, which means the agreement is gonna evolve over time. And so I think this question of recording is so crucially important, because I think it's so important not to assume that an ideology of written knowledge can do the work for us. And that certain forms of orality have to be understood as being part of our transmission. So I think zines, for example, are a weird kind of, it's written, it's photocopied, but you have to be there to get it. Like you have to actually show up to Pumisraf to pick it up. Like you have to have a relationship to the context in which it's happening to even have access to that written knowledge. So as long as we can think of forms of orality, which are also forms of communicating ethics and ways of being with each other, are part of our recording practice, then how exciting, right? Mm-hmm. Like, can we imagine oral ways of recording? Maybe video can do that. Maybe zines can do that. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But I do think it's important to think that there's an oral value system that is what so much of what we're calling organizing is trying to get at. And that our culture is also trying to tell us, oh, no, that's old hat. That's boring. Yeah. Like the exciting thing is making it neutral and kind of like a book or
That's interesting, and I'll just say this one last thing, and I'll pass it on. That's interesting that you say that, because to me, something like People's Voice does bring both of those together, because there is a connection to the newspaper that you need to talk to people about and get them to understand, and then be able to provide them with something written, so that they can, and learn at it at their own pace, when they feel like it, if they're remote. Be able to kind of get the same sort of moment in history. I also had the privilege of reading old issues of People's Voice recently and thinking about a lot of that, oh, wow, this was happening. And this was their analysis of the situation at that time. What a unique opportunity to kind of see that. But thank you.
That's amazing. Other questions from the audience? Anyone? Just hands? One in the back there, yeah.
My question's kind of specific, and it's for you, Vanessa. When you said that 99% of y'all, when you were unionizing, voted yes, does that mean that it was only one person who voted no? And I was kind of wondering what their rationale was and what kind of dialogue there was around that. Because it must be a weird experience to kind of stand alone that way and look at all your coworkers being like, this is good for us, let's go, let's do it. And then be the one guy hanging back being like, ugh. So I was just wondering what the circumstances surrounding that were.
I think that person in particular just didn't have a knowledgeable understanding of what unions actually do. And I think their understanding of it was kind of in that mainstream narrative of ew, gross, oh, that's confrontational, that's being aggressive, oh, they're being difficult, things like that. But I also think they were in a cushy position that they didn't need to do any of that. Or maybe they were in a position of privilege where they didn't need the wage increase because maybe for whatever reason they could afford not to. And we kind of understood as we were organizing that there was certain people that we couldn't exactly bring into the fold at that time because we knew they would essentially narc us out and give the employer a heads up of what we were doing. And if I had any advice would be, keep your cards close to your chest. And, as a woman working in the field that I do, I'm used to being underestimated all the time, but there is a power in being underestimated when they don't know how powerful you are and they wake up one day to a union vote and suddenly, blink and suddenly we're a union. I think that worked in our favor. As for the person who voted against, they ended up losing their job, which was kind of ironic.
For what reason, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, I can't say that. But there was a big changeover at the harbor front. And ask me, catch me outside. But there was just a big changeover and they weren't protected. So I think they just put a lot of faith in their employer, thinking that their employer cared about them and had their, cared about, or was it something at heart, interests at heart. And in fact, they didn't at all. So it just kind of bit them in the ass, I think, a bit at the end there. Okay, Octavio. One of our union members as well, and a main organizer at the power plant union.
Just a funny note. So the vote was actually unanimous. So everyone who voted was 100% for union. I'm sure in this position to add, but to mention, but this person that we're talking about actually refused to vote. So
So technically, it was 100%.
Yeah. So
a non-vote.
100%. So yeah, everyone was on board. Yeah. So.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone, for the questions. We're essentially ending right on time, so this was really great. Thanks once again to our panelists. Yeah, this was great. And thanks to Pumis Raft for hosting again, Exiles Volume 2. And the gallery's still open for another hour. When we stand up, we'll clear the chairs. So please feel free to linger and take a look at all the pieces on the wall. And thanks again for coming.